In November of 1095, Pope Urban II assembled a church council at Clermont in southern France. There, some 300 bishops and clerics gathered together to work through matters of church business. Although the council dealt with many routine issues, Pope Urban planned to make an announcement during the last dates of the meeting that, as it turned out, would change history. For the Pope himself, Clermont was only the latest in a series of towns he'd visited throughout Christendom. For Urban was a pope in exile. He had inherited a conflict that had raged between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor during the second half of the 11th century. The question was, who had the power to invest bishops, lay rulers, or the Pope? For Gregory VII and other great reforming popes who had come before Urban, the answer was clear. The Church alone, and by default her head, the Pope, had the right to appoint bishops. The Holy Roman Emperor, Heinrich IV, whose domains were dominated by powerful bishoprics, could not agree to this. The controversy turned desperate, even violent, and came to a head in 1084, with Heinrich IV driving Pope Gregory VII from Rome and installing his own anti-pope, Clement III. Gregory took refuge with his Norman allies in southern Italy, where he died. Since his election in 1088, Pope Urban II had also been unable to dwell in Rome. Although the Holy Roman Emperor refused to acknowledge Urban, many of Europe's rulers stood with the Pope, including the Normans, who ruled southern Italy and Sicily, and Philip I, King of France. So it was quite bold of the embattled Pope to announce at Clermont that he was excommunicating the French king on grounds of adultery. Historian Régine Pernoud writes, "This excommunication is in itself enough to indicate the mental climate of the time. It is obvious that political considerations were not the dominating factor." Although the Pope needed political allies, more than that, he needed to act decisively as the spiritual father of Christendom, to clarify the role of the papacy, as envisioned by the reformers. In the midst of the crisis of the investiture controversy, Urban intended to dramatically assert his rights as Pope and ultimately to unite all of Christendom in a transcendent project meant to overcome petty power politics for the sake of a higher cause. As the Council of Clermont drew to a close, it was announced that on Tuesday, November 27, Pope Urban would deliver a public speech. Throngs of people assembled, all eager to hear the Pope's message. So large were the crowds that the speech had to be held not in the cathedral, but in the fields outside the town. A wooden platform was raised in front of Clermont's eastern gate, and there, Pope Urban stood and delivered what has been described as the most impactful speech in history. No exact transcript survives of the Pope's words, but several chroniclers did provide their own accounts. One of these was Fulcher of Chartres, a French priest believed by some historians to have been an eyewitness to the Clermont address. The utterances of the Pope, recounted by Fulcher in his chronicle, would change the life of this priest and many others forever. "Since, O sons of God, you have promised him to keep peace among yourselves and to faithfully sustain the rights of Holy Church more sincerely than before, there still remains for you, newly aroused by God's correction, an urgent task which belongs to both you and God, in which you can show the strength of your goodwill. For you must hasten to carry aid to your brethren dwelling in the East, who need your help, for which they have often entreated. For the Turks, a Persian people, have attacked them, as many of you already know, and have advanced as far into Roman territory as that part of the Mediterranean which is called the Arm of St. George. They have seized more and more of the lands of the Christians, have already defeated them in 7 times as many battles, killed or captured many people, have destroyed churches, and have devastated the kingdom of God. If you allow them to continue much longer, they will conquer God's faithful people much more extensively. Wherefore, with earnest prayer, not I, but God, exhorts you as heralds of Christ to repeatedly urge men of all ranks whatsoever, knights as well as foot soldiers, rich and poor, to hasten to exterminate this vile people from our lands and to aid the Christian inhabitants in time. I address those present. I proclaim it to those absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. For all those going, there will be remission of sins if they come to the end of this fettered life, while either marching by land, or crossing by sea, or in fighting the pagans. This I grant to all who go, through the power vested in me by God. The response to Urban's proclamation was instantaneous. Men shouted their approval, crying, Deus levolt, God wills it. So what, then, was the Pope asking of the men of Christendom? What was the occasion for his proclamation, and the campaign to which he summoned them? The Pope called on his listeners to carry aid to their brethren in the East, and they would have understood that he was talking about Christians who dwelt in Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, such territories that, to men and women of medieval Western Europe, constituted the Orient. Urban's hearers would have recognized these lands, some of the oldest Christian territories, locations where Christ had traveled and his apostles had preached. Indeed, a fair number of the Pope's audience might have even seen these lands while traveling as pilgrims to the holy city of Jerusalem. For Christians of this era, pilgrimage was widely popular, and by the late 11th century, as Latin Christendom became increasingly wealthy, more and more Europeans were making the journey east. For these people, Jerusalem was the holiest place in the world, the site of Christ's death and resurrection. Christians were willing to make great financial and physical sacrifices to travel the vast distance to the Holy Land, where they might walk where Christ had walked, stand in the places where he'd preached, and most importantly, kneel at the site of his tomb in Jerusalem's ancient church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Pope's audience also understood that the Holy Land and most Eastern Christian territory was not under Christian rule. Centuries earlier, some 2/3 of the old Roman Christian world had been conquered by a powerful new force emerging from the deserts of Arabia, Islam. In the 7th century, an Arabian merchant named Muhammad founded the religion of Islam. Muhammad's followers, called Muslims, revered him as God's greatest prophet. Fired by the zeal of their new faith, Muhammad and his adherents came to dominate the Arabian Peninsula. Not only a religious, but also a political leader, Muhammad led his followers into combat, establishing the concept of jihad, Islamic holy war. Soldiers who fell in jihad were martyrs of Islam. Muhammad's dynamic leadership set a powerful precedent. After his death in 632, Muslim armies struck out on daring jihads against neighboring territories. Over the course of a century, the Arabs achieved one of the most extensive and rapid conquests in history. Among the lands taken were many of the oldest and wealthiest portions of the Christian world, including Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. Much of this territory had previously been ruled by the Byzantine Empire, which was the old Eastern Christian Roman Empire and the most powerful Christian state during the early Middle Ages. Indeed, the 7th century was disastrous for the Byzantines, as they suffered defeat after defeat to the Muslims and saw their empire reduced to a remnant of its former glory. After their early triumphs over the Byzantines, the Arabs pressed on from Egypt and conquered the remainder of North Africa. By the early 8th century, Muslim armies swept across the Iberian Peninsula and took control of almost all of Christian Spain. From there, the Arabs even launched raids into France, until they were defeated in 732 at the Battle of Tours. The leader of the Christian forces at Tours had been the Frankish commander Charles Martel, an ancestor of many of the men who in the 11th century would be roused by Pope Urban's call. All through the early Middle Ages, Islamic civilization dominated the Mediterranean world. By the 9th century, Muslim forces conquered Sicily and Crete. Urban was calling on the men of the West to overthrow the pagan rulers in the lands of Eastern Christians. But how well did the Pope's audience understand Arab civilization and its religion of Islam? Toward the close of the 11th century, Latin Christians in general possessed a vague comprehension of the Muslim faith. Westerners living in territories that bordered Islamic kingdoms were probably better acquainted with the religion of Muhammad, and some churchmen were beginning the process of studying the other great faith of the Mediterranean. But the men at Clermont understood the enemy identified in the Pope's speech to be distinguished primarily by its non-Christian nature, and the fact that to Urban's audience it was a persecutor of Christians. They equated this enemy of their time with opponents faced by the Israelites in the Old Testament. In fact, Latin chroniclers of the era often used the names of biblical antagonists, Ishmaelites, Moabites, even Gentiles, when describing Muslim enemies. However, according to Fulcher of Chartres, the Pope identified the enemy not as Arabian, but as Turkish. This is no surprise since, over the course of the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks had emerged as one of the dominant forces in the Islamic world. The Seljuk sprang from the nomadic Turkoman tribes of the Russian steppe. After converting to Sunni Islam, they overran Mesopotamia, and by the end of the 11th century, they dominated the core territories of the Arab world, including Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. The energetic Seljuks presented a new danger to the Byzantine Empire. Seljuk armies began to penetrate the Byzantine region of Asia Minor, which was crucial to the empire for the recruitment of soldiers and the production of grain. This is what Urban meant when, according to Fulcher of Chartres, he described the Turks as having advanced as far into Roman territory as that part of the Mediterranean which is called the Arm of St. George. In 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV set out with his army to counter the Seljuk attacks in Asia Minor. The result was a crushing victory for the Turks at the Battle of Manzikert, in which the Byzantine forces were annihilated, and the emperor himself was captured. This was one of the worst military disasters in Byzantine history. The Seljuks subdued virtually the whole of Asia Minor, and were now on the very doorstep of the imperial capital of Constantinople. The situation remained serious for many years. 8 months prior to the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban received an embassy from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus with a request for Western military support against the Seljuk Turks. This appeal from the Byzantines likely played some role in inspiring the Pope to launch an eastern expedition. Those listening to Urban's speech likely would have heard about the rising power of the Seljuk Turks and the defeats suffered by the Byzantines. Recently, the Seljuks had created a chaotic situation in Syria and Palestine, and pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land were suffering violence. Stories of pilgrims running into problems because of the Seljuk Turks were making their way back to the West. The Pope's audience would have grasped the fact that they were being asked to conduct a military campaign, but also to embark on the holy journey of pilgrimage, which would hopefully secure the eastern territories for pilgrim traffic. One of our sources for Urban's speech is an anonymous chronicle written by a southern Italian Norman known as the Gesta Francorum. Some historians believe that the author was a knight, and thus the account provides insight into how a soldier conceived of Pope Urban's call. And so Urban, Pope of the Roman See, with his archbishops, bishops, abbots, and priests, set out as quickly as possible beyond the mountains and began to deliver sermons and to preach eloquently, saying, "Whoever wishes to save his soul should not hesitate humbly to take up the way of the Lord, and if he lacks sufficient money, divine mercy will give him enough." Then the apostolic Lord continued, "Brethren, we ought to endure much suffering for the name of Christ, misery, poverty, nakedness, persecution, want, illness, hunger, thirst, and other ills of this kind. Just as the Lord saith to his disciples, Ye must suffer much in my name, and be not ashamed to confess me before the faces of men. Verily, I will give you mouth and wisdom. And finally, great is your reward in heaven. And when this speech had already begun to be noised abroad, little by little, through all the regions and countries of Gaul, the Franks, upon hearing such reports, forthwith caused crosses to be sewed on their right shoulders, saying that they followed with one accord the footsteps of Christ, by which they had been redeemed from the hand of hell. This account from the Gesta author touches on several important themes that help us understand the appeal of Urban's message to the warrior elite of Western Christendom. The Gesta focuses on the sacrificial nature of the Pope's call. Urban is asking men to embark on a dangerous mission in a faraway land dominated by non-Christian powers. Warfare at home was perilous enough. Everyone listening to the Pope would have comprehended on some level the risks associated with an armed expedition to the east. But the penitential nature of the Pope's proposition is part of what made it so attractive. The Christian knight of the late 11th century was faced with a difficult dilemma. The violent nature of his profession placed his soul at great risk. Here now, the Pope was offering the knight a way to ply his trade while also serving God, rather than engaging in sinful warfare against his fellow Christians at home. The soldier could travel to eastern lands to fight against pagans oppressing his fellow Christians. Thus, it's often been said that Pope Urban launched the Crusades movement by establishing the idea of the Crusade indulgence. We'll talk more about indulgences later. For now, it's sufficient to point out that the Pope was proclaiming the expedition east to be spiritually meritorious. Holy war. For many Christians today, the notion of holy war seems counter to their personal beliefs, but we must consider the mentality of Pope Urban and his audience. For them, war generally fell into one of two categories: unjust war, which was purely sinful, or just war, which wasn't sinful but regrettable. Urban's campaign was something else entirely, and would come to define the Crusades movement. This was military activity that God found pleasing, much like the prayers of a monk in a monastery. The Crusader was a man who set out to fight the enemies of God in a battle that was inherently spiritually righteous. The knight, rather than living out his life in a worldly, sinful profession, could now commit himself to a divinely sanctioned cause and offer up his work to heaven in harmony with the sacramental life of the Church. Pope Urban's appeal is frequently viewed as the beginning of the Crusades, but the concept of holy war had been evolving in the Latin West for centuries. In recent times, popes had been offering spiritual rewards to knights battling Muslims in Spain and Sicily. Indeed, the Norman conquest of Sicily and the gains made by Spanish Christians in the 11th century Reconquista are rightly understood as key developmental phases in crusading. We can see why Pope Urban's summons elicited such an enthusiastic response. The Pope was tapping into powerful sentiments of the era. Yet another chronicler, Robert the Monk, gives his account of the reaction to Urban's appeal. How many of various ages and abilities and stations in life took crosses and committed themselves to pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre? The news of that revered council spread throughout every country, and the story of its important decision reached the ears of kings and princes. It touched a chord, and more than 300,000 decided to go on pilgrimage and took action to carry out their vow, insofar as God had given them the ability. And now, the huge might of the Frankish race began to strain at its bounds, and in spirit, they were already ferociously attacking the Turks. The number given by Robert the Monk of 300,000 is a wild exaggeration, but vastly inflated figures are the norm in medieval chronicles. Nevertheless, Urban's summons proved to be a great success, and many did vow to join the armed pilgrimage to the east. The First Crusade had begun.